This video is dependent upon a chapter from my book, Conversations with My Inner Atheist, chapter 13, titled, Were People Really Demon-Possessed, or Did They Have a Natural Illness? I'm going to begin by reading from Mark 9:17 to 18. Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. Mark 9:17 to 18. And then I say, as Robert Stein observes in his Mark commentary, while these are indeed common symptoms of epilepsy, quote, Mark clearly emphasizes to his readers that the cause of the boy's malady is due to demon possession. So here's an interesting question for us. It looks like this individual had epilepsy, and yet the text describes this person as being possessed by a demon and being exorcised. How should we think about this? Does it entail that people who have epilepsy are demon possessed? No. I think that at the outset, we should definitely say that is not the correct conclusion to draw. So then what do we think? Is it possible that some people who have epilepsy are demon possessed, that this individual happened to be, but we can't extrapolate that in most cases, people who have epilepsy are demon possessed? Possible, it's possible. Another possibility here is that the symptoms look like epilepsy, but in fact, demon possession sometimes manifests like epilepsy, but is in fact completely different from epilepsy. It is certainly possible, right, that all sorts of maladies can manifest similar to other maladies, and yet they are distinct, even though their presentation may be very similar. So I would be inclined to say, in this scenario, that in fact what is happening here is not epilepsy at all. It's demon possession, which can sometimes manifest like epilepsy. But there is another possibility which I want to consider here, and it's one that I talk about in the chapter, and that is the concept of accommodation. So the idea of accommodation within theology is the idea that God meets people where they're at. As John Calvin famously put it, God is like a nurse mother who lisps to a baby, using baby talk, essentially, in a way that the baby can understand and interact with. That's how God interacts with human beings. He comes down to our level and speaks to us in a way that we can understand. And that, in and of itself, when we say accommodation, that means, by implication, accommodation to various errant or limited understandings of the world. In other words, God can reveal himself in particular times and places and moments and accommodate to particular errors of the audience he wants to reach, because his intentional purpose in accommodating to their errors allows him to make a greater insight by accommodating to those errors. Now, let me give you an illustration. This is an illustration that I then give in the book. So I talk about a famous missiologist named Bruce Olson. And Bruce Olson tells the story in his book, Bruchko, where he visited the Motiloni people that he came to live with for 50 years in Colombia. And the Motiloni people, he wanted to introduce modern medicine to them. But in fact, they had what you would say sort of primitive understanding of the world, quote unquote, in that they would attribute various natural maladies to demonic activity, and they would call the witch doctors. So for example, when a pink eye was being spread through the village, they called the witch doctor, and the witch doctor sacrificed a chicken or whatever, did various things, did chants and so on, and trying to make people better, doing the best that they could, which is what witch doctors do, but the people were not getting better. And Bruce Olson, however, has antibiotics, which will be very important to use and could make the people better. What he could have done is gone and said, look, your whole framework of the way that you think about demons acting in the world and infecting people with this malady of their infected eyes, that's wrong. In fact, what they have is a bacterial infection, and this antibiotic we'll kill the infection and they'll get better. He could have said that. But honestly, had he tried to do that, he probably would have lost his audience because he was challenging vast tracts of their worldview, and they would have been incredulous to that. So instead, what Bruce Olson does is he accommodates to them. He accommodates to the understanding of the Motiloni people and the witch doctor. What he says is, quote, "I went to her," that is to the witch doctor, "and told her that I wanted her to see some of the evil spirits that led to disease and death. I took out my microscope under which I had brought to the jungle and put a lump of dirt under it. I had her look into the eyepiece. Oh, yes, I can see them dancing around," she said, and she began singing her chants. So she could see the little bacteria moving within the dirt. And then he says, "Then I put some disinfectant on the dirt and told her to look again. She saw that the disinfectant had killed the germs. It shook her. She had seen that the germs didn't die when she sang her chants. Over a period of time, she introduced disinfectants into the normal ceremonies of the Motiloni people." So here's the key, is that Bruce Olson worked with the witch doctor, and he accommodated to her fallible, errant understanding of the world by allowing her to think that, in fact, what they were dealing with there were demonic spirits, and that he was killing the demonic spirits with the disinfectant and with the antibacterial cream for the eyes. And in fact, what we would say he was doing by our construct is working with modern science and bringing modern science to the Motiloni people. But he brought modern science to them in a way that they could accept and embrace because it was accommodated to the limitations and errors of their understanding of the world. And it is possible, certainly I think it's possible, that Jesus was doing something very similar. And there's two ways that you could think about that. If Jesus was in fact accommodating here, he could have been doing it in terms of his humanity. In other words, perhaps it's possible that this child had epilepsy, and there wasn't any demon as such in this individual, but Jesus accommodated to the understanding of the people in the audience that thought this was demon possession, that understood it in those terms. And he says, "I'm going to defeat that demon." And then he heals the child of epilepsy. That is still, of course, a miracle, but is a miracle accommodated to the understanding of the audience. Now, it's also possible that there is a more radical sense of accommodation here. We read in Philippians 2 that Jesus emptied himself and made himself a servant. And one of the aspects of Jesus emptying himself and making himself a servant is for Jesus himself to take on the limited psychological understandings of a first century Jew. And so we actually have, for example, in Luke 2:40 and Luke 2:52, descriptions to Jesus as a small child growing in wisdom and knowledge and favor with God and other human beings. That clearly entails that Jesus gained in knowledge. And if you gain in knowledge, you are not only acquiring true beliefs, but you're setting aside false beliefs. And that means that in his humanity, in his human nature, Jesus accommodated to some degree of human error, not morally culpable human error, but human error nonetheless, non-culpable human error. And it's possible from that perspective that part of the human psychology of Jesus was to accommodate to the limited understandings of first century Jews in how they thought about things such as epilepsy by understanding them as demon possession. And Jesus likewise, in this understanding, when he emptied himself of knowledge and incarnation, he adopted the understanding of demonic possession as being manifested in what we now call epilepsy. And so in that case, he may have healed that individual believing that he was exorcising a demon, but in fact, what he was doing by healing them was healing them of epilepsy. So what we have here then is at least three different options that I've suggested we can consider when thinking about this text. The first is that it was straight up a demon possession and exorcism. And sometimes exorcism and demon possession can manifest in a way similar to epilepsy, but nonetheless should not be confused with epilepsy. The second option that I suggested is that Jesus could have known that it was in fact epilepsy and not demon possession at all, but nonetheless accommodated to the understandings of his audience and heal the child by describing it in terms of demon possession, much as Bruce Olson described killing the bacteria in the dirt in terms of killing demons. And finally, Jesus could have accommodated to the human understanding of human beings, emptying himself, taking on the worldview of a first century Jew, and actually believing that this was in fact demon possession, but nonetheless exercising his power as Messiah to heal this person. And so in fact, he healed the person perhaps of epilepsy rather than of demon possession. Those are just some of the possible ways, I think the main ways, but there certainly may be other ways as well, of thinking about this text. And thus the interesting question of whether, in fact, when Jesus was exorcising people, he was in fact healing them of epilepsy.